Great, Borodara everybody, good morning. Welcome. My name's Oriel Miller. I'm Director of the IWA, Wales's leading independent think tank. I'm going to be chairing today's session on behalf of the Live Learning Partnership, which is a group of 10 organisations co-led by the IWA and the Wales Co-operative Centre. The other members of our partnership are our Business in the Community, Cardiff Business School, Care Forum Wales, Community Housing Cymru, Cymorth Cymru, the Ethnic Minorities and Youth Support Team East, Wales Council for Voluntary Action, and ERLAB, which is Cardiff University and Nesta. From an IWA perspective, we're very grateful to the National Lottery Community Fund for their contribution to this project. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As this is a webinar on Zoom, you are obviously muted by the host, and we're going to use the Q&A section for questions. Please do feel free to use the chat, however, as we go through. We'll be picking up from both the chat and the Q&A for the Q&A section at the end. Please remember that all chat and questions are recorded, and we will be putting this on YouTube afterwards. We'll be keeping the event to an hour to avoid Zoom overload, but we'll be keeping the link open for a little bit longer if you want to carry on chatting. Okay, so first of all, I'd really like to explain where this idea came from. About 3 weeks into the pandemic, so we're talking early April, I had a number of discussions about cross-sector learning with Audit Wales, and became aware of a project that they were starting using Sensemaker, the software, with publicly funded bodies. And Chris Bolton, who's joined us today, will talk a little bit about that in more detail. At the IWA, obviously, we're an organisation that doesn't represent a sector, trade or interest group. And so we were less involved in some of the immediate service provision in the early stages of the pandemic in comparison to some of our live learning partners. So we thought it would be really useful and in fact essential to replicate this listening exercise across sectors to enable us to have a really good comparison of experience, what's going on within publicly funded bodies, what's going on outside of those. So we started convening the partnership, crunched through the background stuff in terms of a memorandum of understanding between our partners, GDPR and so forth, and really got going in July. What are we trying to do? Let me see if I can go through this next. Here we go. This is what we're going to cover this morning and what we're trying to do with it now. What it is, it's a way to listen to the voices and experiences of people across Wales from every single sector as we move through the pandemic. If there's something we've learned from the last 8 or 9 months, this is not a one-off thing, it's an experience and a process. We want to identify the changes that people want to see sticking and the ones that people think could have significant and widespread impact for others. And the point of this is so that policy and service delivery is influenced for the better. What's really interesting, and I think a real selling point of what we're trying to do here, is that this data and these stories are going to be open to everybody. We're obviously redacting the information of identifying details. We're not asking people to share personal information about details and roles and organisations. We want it to be online as a resource for all. Very similar questions are being used to those being used by Audit Wales, so we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A at the end, because we want to make that comparison. Basically, there's one main question. What have you experienced since March 2020? What have you learned from that? And what do you want to share with us about that experience? And then all the other questions flow from that initial question in terms of tags to the information so that we can learn from it, so that the data can be filtered and searched really effectively. And as we go through this process, we're going to be sharing highlights through a mailing list and through social media. Today's hashtag and the hashtag for the project is #LiveLearning. So you can see all of the partners to the project along the bottom of your screen throughout this presentation, and a number of them have joined me for today's session. That's an initial setting out of what we're here for today. I'm going to hand over to Chris Bolton now for him to explain a little bit more about how they've been using Sensemaker, the software, so far, and what Audit Wales have learned from it. Chris.
Hi, Oriel. Thanks very much. Morning, everybody. If I just run you quickly through a bit of the why we've been using it, particularly some of the how, because it might be slightly different for a few people, but some of the, more importantly, what we've drawn out of it over the last few months. So these are very much our lessons. Just on that screen there, the sort of bit that's faded through is a front page of our website. So very much on the front page of Audit Wales's website now is the COVID learning project. So it's become a major part of what we do. And I say all of the detail, if you want some of the things that come out of it, there'll be, if you follow that link on the website, you'll get through to it. If I could have the next, can I take the slides or does someone else? Oh, thank you. The big why on all of this happened back in March, we suspended our audit programs, and this sort of notion of never waste a crisis. What we've been working around for a while was that when things like COVID happen or other things, people do really interesting and novel activities, and we saw that as an opportunity. How do we get alongside people to see what's happening? It was a big,
Sorry.
Onto that next one with them. So this is a quote from Dave Snowden, who's actually behind Sensemaker. Not those things are coincidental in some respect, but Dave's quote drove some of our actions, that in this crisis, we should try and get innovation teams alongside people's business recovery teams to capture the novel practice. We didn't actually do that. We used our auditors to try and gather what was going on in the world to see if we could try and learn from it as it was happening. And this was quite a shift for audit, in that we usually do things where we kind of go and check, we know the answers. This was, if you like, learn it in a live learning space. So we thought, what do we use for it? And we had worked with Dave before, so we decided to use Sensemaker. And I'll explain some of the reasons for Sensemaker in the next slide. If we could have that, please, Oriel. So why we use Sensemaker, that thing on the right-hand side of the scale is a screen capture from our page that we use Sensemaker in the organization. So it's not visible to the external world. I wouldn't worry about that. The points about why we use Sensemaker is we didn't know exactly what we were looking for. That this was if you remember back to March, April, the world was very, very different, very uncertain. We knew we wanted to do something about learning that was happening out there. We knew certain things, that it wasn't going to be in nice structured documents or places where we'd normally find it. We knew it would be in lots of fragments, so we wanted something that would capture these fragments of information, incomplete stories, if you like, and then allow us to look at the sort of patterns that were emerging, that sort of, could we spot things that were happening? Because I say there was no good practice, no best practice in this space, just new practice. So we wanted fragments, we wanted to find patterns, and we were quite interested in how do we do something quickly. So speed and usefulness were more important to us than perfection. So our traditional audit approach, where you kind of spend months looking at something very carefully, we had to shift some of that. This let us say, how do we use something that has got those points? Plus, we wanted something that was in a future use, so that once we've collected it, we can, that phrase of collect once, used many times, and that led us to Sensemaker, in that we had used it a number of times in the past, and it allowed us to explore these spaces where we weren't exactly knowing what we were looking for. We were looking to explore the data and find things we hadn't seen before. So that was the attraction of Sensemaker. It was something different, not traditional. It got us into spaces where we could find things we weren't looking for. In terms of some of the things that's generated for us, some of you may have looked at it already and wonder not on earth are these triangles are about. So when people, the basic process on it is people provide some information, a fragment of something interesting they've seen, then they tell us what that means. So this process of you go through it and self-interpretation has been really important for us and helped us understand the data better. In that if someone tells you through their own eyes what they mean, that's far less sort of open to bias than someone interpreting on their behalf. What you've got on this screen is a triangle. This is some of our data. We've collected almost 1,100 examples as our auditors, and between April and the end of September was really the peak when they were collecting most of it. So each one of those dots on that triangle represent one of these fragments of interesting things they've seen. Being auditors, they've got a certain mindset, so they tend to sort of pick on things they think are kind of have got some value. So they each one of those, if you like, represents a sort of nugget of really good information. And what the plot on there is telling us, and we're using for some things at the moment, that we're saying what was the focus of what you've seen. Very much our work is driven by Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So there you've got the environment, people, and economic as three bits of what's going on in the world. And some of the data we're seeing coming out of that is a lot of what they'd spotted was in this space of, in this bottom left corner, about how people around, there were people focused issues we were seeing happening out of there, which on reflection perhaps isn't a surprise, but we're interested in them. Some of the things we're going to be looking at, the data in the top, in the top apex of the triangle at the going forward is we're interested in some stuff around climate change. So we're going back to that data to have a look at what people were doing, whether anything specifically looked at it. 3 examples of what have come out of the patterns. Shielding, as we were looking at initially, none of us had ever heard of shielding before COVID. Early days, we were looking at some of the entries coming in and started to spot a pattern mentioning shielding, but they were all very different. And what we ended up doing was saying there's something going on here. We went back to the data and looked at it and said, do you know what? Everyone's doing something very different around shielding. We probably need to say something. So we started quickly sharing things through tweets and blogs as examples of shielding that might help others. That led us down another path through the data, and we quickly spotted there were differences in how people reported how to get a COVID test online. We just put an example of what we thought was a good one, and other people changed their websites to be as quick as they were. That was one example. Mental health emerged from the data very early, that there was a lot going on about people's activities to support their staff and communities' well-being and mental health. We shared a lot of that and ran some webinars last week and have supported with a number of blogs. So those 2 specific examples came out of the data as we're moving along with many others you'll see on that link on our webpage. The other bit, sort of looking a bit more sort of to the future, digital inclusion has popped up everywhere. So at that point, Oriel mentioned about how do we start to share data. We're meeting with Sarah Woolett from Wales Co-op, I think it's Friday or next week, to start to share some of the data that we've picked up about digital inclusion. Are there things Sarah didn't know about, or that might help in some of the work Wales Co-op are doing? And as I mentioned it earlier, the next bit, we're looking at that data that comes from the top of this triangle, specifically around any specific people are doing around climate change. One last slide, if I could, just the last one about some of our learning points from it, doing this very rapidly. This is all about learning, and in our day-to-day work, we kind of taking time to think, pause and learn what's going on doesn't happen. And what this has provided is a very structured way to say we are learning about this. And I think that kind of helps, because everyone says they want to learn, but you need to kind of almost force it. There's many ways to sort of look at all of this data. We changed our systems as we went through, and one of the easiest ways we ended up with something called a triage, where 3 people would get involved at any time as just checking across each other. Are we seeing, does this make sense? I would say from what we've started, start small, simple, and keep changing it. It's a very agile approach, that what's going to work for you, kind of be prepared to try things and change as you go along. And a key one is as you collect it, this collect once, use many times is right, but also be prepared to keep using it for a long time. That's a bit about climate change. We've got it, we've captured it, we're going to use it over the next year to look at it. And my final one, I think this is really important, why I think the Live Learning Partnership is so important, that diverse viewpoints matter. What's been collected for audit is our viewpoint. What will be collected through Wales Co-op Centre will be a different viewpoint, but actually the power comes in the diversity, and the answers to what we need all this lie in where we all overlap. So the more diversity, the better we're doing. And I say, and if we've got a means of then sharing data, even better. And is that okay, Oriel?
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. That's great. I'm just going to take, there we go. I think a few points I want to pick up on there before I hand over to Steve. The idea that all of the partners across the bottom of your screen, they've got their own way in to share that data with a specific URL, but there's also a generic one. So you can search by everything that's coming in through your own URL, but also see everybody else's. One of the things that we noticed early on at the IWA is there are lots of fantastic learning in specific geographical places, obviously, where people were dealing with practical issues and having to work together across boundaries and across organizational boundaries, and put what was the old day job on one side to deal with the immediate priorities of that response. But that wasn't necessarily transferring to other places, even where those same organizations were also working. So there have also been lots of sort of sector specific learning exercises that have been going on over recent months. But again, nothing that's horizontal that brings those sectors together. So this is a key purpose of what we're trying to do. To do that, I'm going to just go next to Steve Evans, please, Family Housing Association, who's going to talk from their perspective. Why are they interested in joining this partnership and being part of the whole project? Steve.
Thanks, Oriel, and hi everybody, good morning. Yeah, thank you for asking me to speak today. We've been part of the Community Housing Cymru group, if you like, that are taking part in the Live Learning Partnership, and we're really excited to get the opportunity to be part of the group for a number of reasons. So we are a smallish housing association. We deliver a range of services, care, support and housing, obviously, across South Wales, although we're based in Swansea, but we cover quite a big geographical patch, which was part of the reason why we were so interested in getting involved with the project. And there are other housing associations, obviously, as part of that as well, to link now with Coastal, Melin and Monmouthshire Housing Association, all part of the CHC subgroup, if you like. The reason we're keen to take part was, largely because of the specific project. We're also really keen to understand the impact that COVID's had on people and their experience, and what we can learn from that and maybe adjust in how we deliver services and relate to them and communicate. So really interested in the specifics of this project and felt like a really good partnership to be part of too. So that was a real attraction for us, but I think it's probably fair to say we've also got other interests too, and felt like it was a really good opportunity to test the Sensemaker software. Chris, probably largely responsible for me being a bit geeky about Sensemaker and getting really interested in it. I think he and I met probably about 18 months ago and had a conversation, and we just feel like there's a huge amount of potential in this way of gathering stories to enable us to learn from the experiences of our tenants and of our staff, and to be able to learn from that and adjust the way that we work accordingly. Really interested in the lot of Dave Snowden's work that sits behind Sensemaker, as well as the tool itself, and it feels very relevant to us because of the range of services that we provide and the geography that we have, which can make it really difficult to reach representative groups of our tenants and really understand what people are experiencing and what we need to do in order to make that a better experience for them. So really interesting partnership, and really excited about, once we really start getting some data from this, what that will tell us. I think the other thing that we recognize is that Sensemaker is a really innovative way of gathering that information. So we've historically used pretty static closed questionnaires, surveys of people, and that isn't how Sensemaker works at all. It's much more open questions, as Oriel and Chris have both shown really in their presentations already, and that just gives us the opportunity to really hear from people without filtering our own experiences over theirs, and perhaps not necessarily hearing the real stories. And as I said, that's really important to us. We're, along with many other housing associations, moving to a much more person-centred approach to the way we deliver services. And it's really critical that we do really hear what people think, and reaching them can be quite difficult. So we see lots of potential in Sensemaker going forward for us, as well as being really specifically excited about this project. So yeah, that's why we got involved. Really happy to be involved, and really pleased to see that it's being used in this way in a perhaps an opportunity to develop further and extend the use of Sensemaker in the future across the public sector. So yeah, that's our reason for getting involved, and really keen to see what comes from it.
Thanks very much indeed, Steve. That's really handy. And Rossi, I'm going to come to you next, please, because you've already had an experience using Sensemaker software, particularly within the sector that East works in. Rossi, could you tell us a little bit more about that and what Steve was referring to there in terms of shortening the distance between people's lived experiences and the descriptions of that, and getting that to decision makers as quickly as possible? Rossio.
Thanks, Oriel. Yeah, really pleased to have been invited to be part of this important partnership. I think it is a huge opportunity to capture this moment and to learn from it. my charity East supports ethnic minority people across Wales. And as we know, the pandemic has hit that community very hard, has hit them disproportionately. It has exacerbated long-standing pre-existing inequalities. It's exposed them like never before. So the impact of this situation has been huge, but equally the response to it has been as incredible as the impact. So the response to it from the plethora of community groups, of all sizes, most of them very small, the opportunity to capture that is what is so interesting and important about this partnership and about this this project and this piece of software. Ultimately, we know from the survey and the piece of work that Oriel mentioned, we have used Sensemaker already as part of our survey, which sought to understand the experience of BAME community groups and organisations in the pandemic, and sought to capture and understand how they responded to it. That report has been published recently. It's on the East website if you would like to look it up. We had about 35 responses. We understand the sector in Wales, the BAME sector, to comprise of roughly 100 or so small community organisations. But what we have learned through both the survey and through our experience of just talking and engaging with this network is that their response has been incredibly innovative. Change has been made incredibly quickly. The pace of change and the way in which many services and the way that groups work has had to adapt has been quite unprecedented, but also inspiring. And the resilience that individual people and groups have shown is something that we need to learn from, really, and we would like to capture it. And this is what we would really encourage, and we're hoping to keep encouraging community groups who may not traditionally get involved in this kind of initiative, can seem a bit techie, but we are going to do our best to reach out to our networks and our community groups to encourage and support them to share their stories through this platform, to show how they have been part of the solution in these trying times, and for that effort and that work to be recognised and valued. They say that, they say history is written by the victors, and we just want to make sure that the important contribution of BAME people and BAME community groups is recognised, is valued, is recorded for the future, and that contribution is made visible, rather than, as too often happens, there's a chance that underrepresented groups can just remain invisible. And if Oriel hadn't really reached out and invited East to be part of this partnership, it's highly likely that the voices and the experiences and the stories of people from minority ethnic backgrounds living in Wales, working hard, doing an incredibly important job on the front line in community groups, but also in the public sector organisations, that would not have been visible or recorded for posterity. So we're really excited to keep learning. We're at the very beginning of this journey, and we're really excited by the opportunity to learn from the other partners, as well as sharing our own learning, with the wider partnership. And I think it's a moment in time. We're all on a journey. We haven't been here before. It's an experiment, but I can really see the potential, and we will be doing our best to encourage and support as wide a cross-section of groups and individuals to really take part and be heard and be recognised. So thank you so much, Oriel. Looking forward to it.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Ross. And I am going to come, Karen, to you next. A little bit about like a million years ago, since all this started, at least in the UK in March. But we're at really early days still, and we have to recognise that. There are lots of people who are still busy delivering at the front line of services, and particularly as cases rise again in Wales, sadly, at the moment. But the stories that we're going to share with you now, and some of the lessons that we're going to share with you now, come from the period from July until the end of October. So if you think about it, the time of the lifting of the first lockdown to the 5 rate being imposed in Wales. So Karen Lewis from the Wales Co-operative Centre is going to tell us a little bit more and share back some of the key themes of what we've had so far. Karen, and I will go forward on the slides when you give the word.
Oriel. Thank you. Yes, as Oriel said, we're way down the line from where Chris is. I mean, obviously the amount of data that they've collected at Audit Wales is significant. I think to date, that the analysis I'm just going to highlight to you this morning is based on 65 responses. So as a partnership, we've been sending out the links within our own organisations and more widely. You've heard earlier from Steve. So one of our partners, Community Housing Cymru, has been sending out Sensemaker link right across their stakeholders and have had a really good response. At the Wales Co-op Centre, we've sent it through to our staff, and we've had some good responses from staff. And we've also now sent the link out to all our membership. So we're looking forward to getting more stories coming through. I think I just wanted to say something before I start talking about the analysis, because I think both Steve and Chris picked up on this. When I first got involved in this and was speaking to Oriel about it, I was slightly skeptical, although I know of Dave Snowden's work for many years, thinking, how is this actually going to be different to people, to standard surveys? How are we going to convince people to take part in this? Well, it's significantly different. I think, that it's not a survey, and what we're getting out of this are fragments, are stories, are lived experiences. So very different from the traditional survey approach. So I just flag that up because that may well come up in our questions later, but it is a very different approach. So I'll just flick through some of the data that we've received, that we've drawn out of the work that we've done as a partnership so far. I'm saying we, I'm using the royal we here, feeling a bit like the Queen, because these slides I'm presenting you are based on work done by Emir at Lab at Cardiff University. So Emir, I know you're out there somewhere in cyberspace, so please feel free to chip in if there's anything you want to add, because I'm reflecting back the great work that you've done for us. Thank you, Oriel. Okay, so you saw earlier with Chris this this triangle approach, the triad, which basically we've got the three same areas here that Chris looked at: the environment, people and society, and economic. Obviously, we've got significantly less data here than Chris had, but again, you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, that in the results that we've seen and the responses that we've had, people's stories and fragments and experiences have been very much focused down in the left-hand corner around people and society. And I suspect that's predominantly because people have been talking about working from home, they've been talking about their well-being. So I think that's probably why most of our responses are down there. And within those responses, we've seen a real mix of positive and negative aspects, often within the same story when people are talking about working from home, for example, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But, mixed responses, the whole pandemic experience, people have been seeing positives, but they've also been seeing negatives. Thank you, Oriel. So the dyads, don't be put off. If you're like me and you're somebody who sees a graph and feels it's time to do my tax return or something and has a bit of a panic, when you get into the Sensemaker software, it doesn't feel at all like this. So this isn't something that needs to put off any respondents. The Sensemaker tool is very intuitive, very easy to use, and very much based on people's stories and experiences. So this is just, the dyad is just a sort of binary, if you like, exemplar of what we've found. And this one here, we're looking at impact. And we're looking at what people thought the impact, and this is the impact of the experience they've related, their story, their fragment. What was that impact? And you can see here quite clearly that the number of people who looked at this impact as being small is very small. And as we move further up towards the right-hand side, towards significant, the numbers increase. As I said, these are small numbers because we're just starting, but there's a very clear pattern emerging there that people are definitely seeing this as something significant in their lives. As I said, probably unsurprisingly, because this is a fairly dramatic time that we're living through. Thank you, Oriel. And again, in this question, we asked about the future. Was this fragment, this story that they were telling us, was it something that was time limited? Was it something that would have a long-term application, a long-term use? And again, you can see a little bit more mixed here, but again, pretty much most people, the majority of people, there is something long-term here that is either going to impact myself or my organization or wider society. So this wasn't seen as something that when it's all over, everything will be back to normal. Next one, please. And building on that, so here, how do you think things will operate after the crisis mode, and how would you like them to operate? We've put these through two side by side because you can sort of see the linkages here. So future, people are very much feeling that we're going to be in a completely different new world. Again, you can see, sorry, I can't point to the screen because Oriel's showing it, but you can see with the average, thanks Oriel. So the average, the dotted line up the middle, you can see up on the right hand side, quite significant here that people really think things will be in a different world. And same on the other one, how would you like them to operate? Again, in a completely different new world. So maybe not surprising, but quite interesting that, you know, the views and the experiences that are coming through are chiming with what people are actually imagining will happen. Next one, please. So working from home, now this was an interesting one, and I'm sure many of us here will have had similar experiences around working from home. So significant impact on people's lives, both not positive and negative. And when I say positive and negative, that was within the same stories. So it wasn't a case of people finding it completely positive or completely negative, but very, very mixed. People's work-life balance has been dramatically affected. Again, positive and negative examples. We had people saying that it was great, they didn't have to do the commuting anymore, and that gave them more time to spend at home with families, etc., or going out for walks. But also there were issues where people felt that their life balance had taken, that their life experience had taken second place to work, because particularly people who are working at home in quite cramped experiences, finding it very difficult to switch off. You know, they were working at the place that was also where they were eating, living, and sometimes sleeping. So very mixed here. And unsurprisingly, mental health was a significant issue. For some people, their mental health had improved. People talked about being able to go outside more, spending more time with nature. Other people found it's significantly challenging not seeing people in real life, face-to-face situations. And I think we had comments in Emia's transcript where people were saying that they felt that it was hampering their creativity and spontaneity, and everything was now timed and planned, and through Zoom calls like this one. And so some of the fun that they had speaking to colleagues, the pleasure they had just chatting to people over a cup of coffee had gone. And that was also impacting on balancing balancing family life with their work. Okay, thanks, Oriel. So this is interesting, and I think this is something certainly that we as an employer will be interested in looking at as we move forward. So greater consideration of employees' well-being for employers, and evaluating people's working styles and home situations. Sorry, I'm reading a PowerPoint, which I hate doing. You can see up there what we're talking about. But the essence of this is a sense that in some cases, and this was good to see, that people felt that their employers were really taking on board the significance of this change and were thinking about the support that they could offer for well-being. Some talked about daily catch-ups across the whole team, which weren't compulsory, but were there if you needed them. Other people talked about their employer being less focused on timesheets and more on quality of delivery and ensuring that people were achieving and meeting their objectives without becoming overly burdened in terms of their mental health. So again, we're very early down the road on this one, but I am particularly interested in looking at this a little bit more. And I think most organisations, small or large, would be interested in hearing more from their employees. Again, all of us do surveys. We do a regular survey for our employees around well-being, but it's quite a tick box exercise. And I think this was giving us a much more nuanced sense of where people felt their employers could do better. And I suppose, just to sum it up, it was the sense that we got from quite a few respondents was that going forward, and when, as Oriel said, we are not out of the woods on this at all, and it's going to be some considerable time before we're back to working in ways that we worked before, if at all. So there was a sense that some companies and organisations might need to establish a much more sophisticated way of understanding their employees instead of adopting blanket procedures, and be far more focused on individual needs and well-being. And I think that's quite an interesting lesson perhaps for some employers to take. Thank you, Oriel. And I think now we should have, we've got about 20 minutes left, Oriel, for people to talk, contribute. So I'll pass it back to you now, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Thanks very much indeed, Karen. Can I ask all the panelists to put their videos back on and join me for conversation and picking up on Q&A? I think one of the things that enables people to join and to share their stories is that it is anonymous. You know, we're not gathering people's emails, we're not gathering information about them as they come through. We're asking people up front on the first screen, please don't share personal information about yourself, just share your experience. And it is deliberately very, very open from that perspective. We've got a question here from David Williams, which is, how are we going to access people who are digitally disconnected? And there are, I think, before I throw it open to the panelists, there's a thing here which is, you can either do it on a screen, on your computer, on your laptop, on your iPad, but you can also do it on your phone. There's an advantage to doing it on the phone because you can have the conversation with somebody and stop and save it in a way that you can't actually do it on the computer. So it may be somebody putting in their story themselves, or it may be somebody with a support worker or a carer or somebody who visits them from church or whatever, saying, oh, have you got something to share? Should we do it together? And do that in a kind of as part of a conversation. Can I come back to you, Karen, in terms of the digital aspect of things? Because I know that the Co-op leads a lot of work on digital connection, please.
Yes, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's the same question that we're challenged with all the time. So at the Wales Co-op Centre, we lead Welsh Government's Digital Communities Wales programme, which I know many people in the session today will be familiar with. I think what you've just said there, Oriel, is exactly right. So that's what we would call assisted digital. So it's a question of, I think, finding trusted guides, trusted helpers, whether that's through frontline staff, you know, people in libraries, people who are helping people to get online. This is actually a really good tool to encourage people to say, well, look, you know, here's something you might want to look at, because people want to hear your voice, hear your opinion. Here's your chance to contribute. But there is no simple, neat answer. This is an online tool. So if you do have, if you are digitally excluded, digitally disconnected, have very poor digital skills, then, you know, realistically, you're only going to be able to do this with some assistance. But that's the case for accessing every public service that is online at the moment. So it's something that, you know, that Welsh Government is challenged with looking at all the time.
Well, we've tried to make it as accessible as possible,
Yeah.
obviously. Steve, thanks, Karen. Steve, could you talk us through a little bit about how you would be doing this kind of stuff from family housing's point of view?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ariel. I think you've largely hit the nail on the head. So far we've sort of rolled it out with staff to get them used to using it, but then we would see that kind of assisted approach very much. So we have, most of our tenants are able to access services online, but those who can't, that we would really want to hear from, we don't want to leave those out because that won't be a full picture of what people are really thinking and doing and feeling. No. So it is really important. But we have support workers, we have housing officers, we have people who can facilitate that. The reason we've kind of gone with staff first because we felt it was important that they got used to the tool before they.
What was their feedback, Steve? What were they saying about when they were using it for themselves, for their own experiences?
Yeah, generally, sorry, from the staff, do you mean?
Yeah.
Positive, really. Kind of early days in terms of our feedback, but lots of positive. People have found it very easy to use, surprisingly easy. I think a lot of people thought it was going to be very complicated because it was new, but it's a very intuitive tool, and I think they've really appreciated that and found that it's actually really refreshing, not being asked a series of closed questions that are necessarily going to, produce a satisfaction level out of 5 or whatever we traditionally often do. This is much more agile in terms of the way that the data is collected and displayed. So it's been really positive, and they see that their role in helping to roll that out so that we can gather the experiences of tenants and other people that we work with.
Thanks very much. Rossio, can I come to you? There's a really interesting question here from Emma Lewis, who works in the third sector, who says, in the future, getting funding will depend on demonstrating how much our services are worth. Can we find a way of agreeing a monetary value of our time and services so that when we most need to defend our funding, we can? Now, this is a challenge right across the third sector, and obviously, as much one for the IWA as it is for East and others, I would imagine. But how demonstrating our impact and demonstrating how people's voices and experience is shaping what we do. What's your take on that?
Oh, thanks, Oriel. I don't. Yeah, it would be great if we could agree a way of, a definitive way of measuring and kind of monetizing our impact. But I don't think we're necessarily going to all agree on that. But this is a really important tool for at least trying to find a way of at least recording our impact and understanding the different ways in which we have impact. I think we're in globally we're in a time of huge transition. So even if we try to kind of put a monetary value on our impact, I think we're starting to understand that isn't even money, even pound signs don't give us the full picture.
Yeah,
we need to understand things in a more sustainable, sort of holistic way. We need to understand the environmental impact of services, of people's actions, the mental health impact, the impact on communities in terms of their cohesion and so on. So I don't even think that that is definitely a need in terms of how we measure the impact on economically, but I don't think that even that wouldn't give us the full picture. But I don't have an easy answer to Emma's question, I'm afraid. But I think this is part of the solution.
Given it a good shot, and I think one of the things that Sensemaker does, and this project hopefully will do, is bring through some stories to set alongside the data in terms of the return on investment from those services. There's a question here from Katie Cook, which is, do you have a number of stories that you're hoping to gather? And do we feel like we're getting a good spread of respondents in terms of location, health conditions, caring responsibilities, and so forth? And I think the first thing to say to that is we're just starting. We don't have a target on this. It's a learning by doing kind of experiment. And Chris, you and I have talked at length with Dave Snowden about this as well. And certainly he and I had a long conversation at the beginning, which is start with a small group of organisations organisations, and then gradually expand, so move out. And we are interested in expanding the partnership, so if your organisation would like to join us, do please email us at livelearning@iwa.org.uk to join the partnership. There are some techie things that we would need to go through in terms of expanding the licence, because there's a cost for that, which is another question I'll come to in a tick. But also, we as a partnership have agreed how we're going to use the data that's coming through, and what we're going to say about that. But Chris, talk us through from your perspective. You know, there is no target for this, is it? It's a here's an opportunity, let's see where this goes kind of exercise.
Yeah, from our perspective, it wasn't the same response from every single person. That some of our auditors grabbed it and ran with it. Others were kind of just, you know, small baby steps, because it's a different way of working for us in capturing live learning. Setting targets, I'd avoid setting targets that you must collect 40, because there's all the world of what happens around how people comply with targets. And from, if Sam, who knows our data very well, who's on the call as well, he'll comment that actually quality beats quantity. And when people are engaged and they're sharing stuff that is meaningful to them, those are far more valuable entries than just people doing it because they've got to. And that's been our learning. So say every one of those 1,000 odd we've got, because people were engaging because they wanted to. They're high quality entries, so we weren't kind of sifting things just because people felt they had to. So that would be a learning point, I'd say. I mean, interesting, the bit about targeting areas, what we've got now is people who are familiar with it. So we're thinking about where do we go next? So that bit I mentioned about climate change is an area we're interested in. We're pondering on the question, and if you like, it's a Dave Snowden phrase, that we've got a network of people who are used to using it now. Do we activate the network to ask specific questions around climate change? So that's something that we're pondering with. So that's a kind of evolution. Once you get people used to it, do you then probe on specific areas the phrase is a kind of human sensor network is the phrase that gets used, but kind of that's a bit further down the line.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because at the moment it's just one main question and then lots of tags following from that main question. But you could say, okay, this month we're interested in hearing from carers, or in particular, or this month we're interested in particular of hearing from teachers, for instance. But at the moment we haven't done that. We said we want to hear from everybody. There's a couple of questions here around does the project have a nominal target for participation across partners for value in the data, or is every voice important? And I think there's a simple answer there. Every voice is important. We want to hear that spread of experiences. And we're not trying to get representative samples. This is not an academic exercise. This is a listening exercise to citizens across Wales. We're not saying we want to hear only from these groups. Yes, we want to promote it, of course, to underrepresented groups, but we want to hear from everybody in that mix. So that's the openness of this. And the conversations that I've been having so far with other organisations who want to join the partnership, Race Council Cymru being on that list obviously too, is demonstrating the interest. But we might also want to go, for instance, to libraries to make sure that we're going out through people who visit their local library, or were visiting their local library on a regular basis, and who use the libraries as a community hub for so much more than just getting books out, for instance. There's a question here from, or I think it's a bit of a, no, there is a question from Mary Wimbury from Care for in Wales, who's on the group, which is that the pandemic has meant that some people have a great deal more time on their hands, whereas others are working harder than ever. And I think we'd all recognise that, absolutely. How do we ensure we hear from the second group as much or more than from the first? And obviously she knows Care for in Wales has a role in this, but there are so many pressures on people at the moment. Karen, can I come back to you? That's not an easy one, is it? How do we make sure, because there are people who are going to be so focused on the delivery stuff right now, but there are also people who are thinking, well, what do I do? I've got time to, learn a new language, bake sourdough, whatever. Some of that's changed, and there's a different normal for so many people at the moment. But we need to make sure that we are not inconveniencing and getting in the way of people who have got those super busy day jobs at the moment too.
Did you ask me, sorry there, Oriel, to
Yes,
respond?
Karen, yes, please.
I mean,
yeah.
I think I wanted to just pick up on something because it probably links into this as well on what Chris was saying previously, in response to the question about how do we evidence the value and the worth of this. I think we have to just be clear that this is a very, very different way of working. It's a completely different approach. It's not a bean counting exercise, you know, and I, as much as anyone, you know, I've worked in the third sector or in universities pretty much all my life. I know how difficult it is to convince funders, but that shouldn't drive this, because I think this, as you said, Oriel, this is a listening exercise. So we have to open our eyes and think this is something different. This is something fresh. In answer to your question there, I think I raised this when we were first looking, you know, how do we get people to take this on, to see something drops through their email? Why should they go to this link rather than others? And for me, I think, and we've got a lot of work here to still as a partnership to do, and I think anybody who picks this up similarly, is to find a way of making a convincing case that people's voices will be heard. And I know that, Oriel, we've had conversations about this, and you know, you're speaking within Welsh Government, for example, but it doesn't just have to be Welsh Government. But once this starts to be shared as open data and it's out there and people are actually picking it up and making changes and policy decisions based on it, then I would hope people will see that it has some value beyond a traditional survey that goes into a black hole. That's my personal view. I don't know.
I think that's really helpful. Chris, can I come to you first? You're going to need to unmute yourself first.
It was just a reflection on the bit that there are people who are really head down, really busy, and some who may have a little more time. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for some of those people to be almost like observers. So if you can kind of work with some people who've got some time on their hands, can they be used in a role where they're doing the observation and collecting on behalf? So there's someone in the chat who's an anthropologist. I mean, this isn't going into that space, but that notion of sort of community observers, because in a way, that's what our auditors did when they were collecting. They were acting as observers into the public sector. So there's a way of collecting that it doesn't have to be someone's up to there with so much work. It goes right back to that point at the beginning that you put that I mentioned, that you put your innovation team in alongside the business recovery teams. Well, actually, someone observing is in sort of that role.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's sort of born out of where this all started from. I think, Chris, in the early conversations that you and I were having at the beginning about how do we capture that learning and share it effectively. And to do that, somebody's got to be noticing it. But if you're not noticing it, if you don't have a mechanism both to notice and pull it in, then you can't share it back out again. So I want to pick up a little bit on what Karen said just now around what are we doing with this data. So to start with, and like I said before, this is a learning by doing kind of project altogether. We don't have a specific member of staff across our respective organisations or hosted by any of our organisations in the partnership to drive this forward. We're all doing this on top of our normal day jobs, and we're going to look for some funding for somebody to do the data analysis, interpretation, and hopefully some of the project coordination too. There's a couple of questions on can you share the questions or method of collecting stories that Sensemaker uses from Kay Lemon. So I just wanted to share my screen very quickly on this is what the main screen actually looks like once you get past the tick box GDPR thing. So we're literally asking people to share your information in the first box before. There's a big descriptive chunk of text there. And it could be anything, something's been made, a process, an experience, or a different feeling. And we're really asking people not to think about, is this relevant, but think about what is it that you want to share and to name it as well. Name it in a way that matters, that makes sense to them. Then we're asking a little bit about what describes the organisation that you work for, and that maybe you don't work for an organisation, that's absolutely fine. If you work for an organisation that isn't listed there, to name it. And then what area is your example from? And this is drawn from predominantly from the WCVA list, but we've also added things in that the partners wanted to see pulled out separately. That means that we can search and tag by all these different bits of information. And then we talk about what type of activity is this about. So is this about staffing? Is this about IT? What are you talking about? Maybe about none of that. And then we're also asking people who needs to hear about what you've described, and to be specific about that. And then how direct an experience was this? Was this something that happened to you, or that you did, or was it something a little bit further removed, or it's something you heard about on social media and you think, oh, that's great, somebody needs to hear about that? How do you feel about it? And then these are the triads that Chris was talking about, and you move them around depending on what you think the relationship between those 3 points on the triangle is. Same thing for that one in terms of the focus. These are the dyads. Is this something that was proactively done, or is this something that is adapting what exists now? And then we ask people to share what they think can be learned from it. Again, moving on to look at what difference has this made, where is this happening? And we decided that most people will know what their council is, even if they don't necessarily know what their health board is, for instance. So we've gone for tagging it by councils, but you might not want to say that. You could just not say that at the bottom. And then talk about what kind of difference could this make? So going back to what Karen showed earlier on. And is this something that could carry on indefinitely? So what we want to look at is the stuff that could carry on indefinitely. Significant impact could be widespread as well. Those are the gems that we want to pull through this. Often to learn, you need to fail about 15 billion times. So it's about acknowledging that and talking about how you've gone through that process of learning and as an organisation. And then a few things future focused, and then just a final catch up on, is there anything else? Is there anything else you want to share that we haven't already asked you? And then that's it. And then if you press next, it takes you to, do you want to share something else? If so, start the whole thing again. So each of this set of questions on one page is just about one particular experience or one particular thing that happened. So that's what it actually looks like. There are sliding scales. A question from Hayley Binnington. Sliding scales in terms of the cost of the Sensemaker tool. What we've done as a partnership is negotiated a single license, and everybody has contributed to their proportion of that license, and obviously translation costs too. So it exists in Welsh as well as in English. So you can go in through whichever one you want to go through. So we've put a little bit of money in the pot to be able to continue that, and we're keeping the whole thing open until about July next year. And then we'll see what happens. Like Chris says, we want to keep collecting the information, then mine it a number of times, depending on what there is. So we've now got a poll that we're going to, this is the first time we've done polls on Zoom. Every day is a school day. First time on poll, and clear. Could you get the poll going, please? We've got 4 simple questions. Brilliant. Here we go. 4 simple questions that we want to ask you about. What do you think of this idea? Are you likely to share your own story? Are you likely to encourage others to share theirs? And do you think this could be useful for your organisation? So very simple, just as a bit of a snapshot. We'll just keep that going on the side. And then I think we're going to need to wrap up because it's 11 o'clock. So what we want to do is we really, really, really want to underline that the whole live learning partnership, it's not a series of surveys, it's much, much more of an ongoing listening exercise. And already we're seeing the value of that. So for instance, there's an inquiry launched by the Economy, Infrastructure and Skills Committee at the Senate, at the Welsh Parliament now, looking at the impact of working from home. There's already stuff coming through from what we've gathered so far that we can feed in. So that's one way, and we'll be doing that. The other thing is we've got a direct line in to Welsh Government from a number of, not only from our own individual organisational existing connections, but also through a team which is looking at how Welsh Government engage really effectively with external stakeholders. So when we're spotting things that are policy and practice specific, we'll be taking those and saying, look, here's something you need to know about, and this is the potential impact that it could have. So in terms of shortening the distance between people who are experiencing it and people who are telling us what they think, and decision makers, what we're trying to do is concertina that and continue to concertina that, so that people don't just sort of think, oh, well, this is how things are for the foreseeable future, and that's it. I don't have an opportunity to share my voice and to have my voice be heard. The other thing we're going to be doing, like I said, is we're going to be sharing snippets on social media as things come through, but also a digest. And one of the things that will be coming through your inboxes to your inboxes in the next couple of days, is a short summary of the stories gathered so far, and an example of both the triads and the dyads too, in English and in Welsh, to everybody who's registered for this webinar. It's about 7 pages so far, and it gives you some contact details and a little bit more in terms of the project, what we're doing. We've had, since that initial chunk from July to October of 65 stories or so, we've doubled that in the last month already. We think there's an appetite for people. People want to share their stories. People want their voices to be heard. That's a very, very human thing. And this is one way that we can do it. We want to, we really need your help, please. Please encourage, please share your own stories. Please encourage others to share theirs, no matter who it is. And encourage your friends, your families, your colleagues, the people you meet in the newsagent, people you meet in the post office, all sorts of different people to share their stories too. If you'd like to join the mailing list, please email us at livelearning@iwa.org.uk. I think Ellen's already put that in the chat. We'll gradually be setting up a way you can join the mailing list via the website itself in due course. And thanks very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you to all the panelists who've put in their time and effort to contributing today. We're really excited about the potential that this project has as our lives here in Wales continue to change over the coming months. We really hope that you're going to join us in capturing that learning and sharing it to best effect for the people and citizens of Wales. Thanks very much indeed, everybody.